Good afternoon and welcome. Please make yourselves comfortable and help yourself to the food in the back. This debate concerns whether a perfect God exists, and we have two very distinguished speakers with us today to have it. It's my pleasure to welcome first Dr. Bryan Caplan of George Mason University, where he's a professor of economics and research fellow at the Adlestein. Dr. Caplan is also a scholar at the Cato Institute and a former contributor to the Freakonomics blog that some of you may be familiar with. He is currently a publisher of his own blog, which if you're not familiar with it, you're in the minority, since he has upwards of over 9,000 subscribers at the moment. It's called betonit.ai. Dr. Caplan holds degrees from two prestigious economics programs, receiving his BA at UC Berkeley in 1993 and a PhD from Princeton in 1997. But he is best known for his iconoclastic applications of economic reasoning to practical questions of public life, such as in his books The Myth of the Rational Voter, Why Democracies Choose Bad Policies, published in 2007 by Princeton University Press, Selfish Reasons to Have More Kids, Why Being a Great Parent is Less Work and More Fun Than You Think, published in 2011 by Basic Books. And the one that has attracted a lot of attention recently is The Case Against Education, Why the Education System is a Waste of Time and Money, published in 2018 by Princeton University Press. Most recently, Dr. Caplan is the author of Build, Baby, Build, The Science and Ethics of Housing Regulation, a graphic novel presenting a unique policy perspective in a fun format for the general reader, which is available for pre-order on Amazon now. I'm sure he'd be happy to talk with you about that afterwards. Please welcome Dr. Bryan Caplan. I'm also pleased to welcome Mr. Matthew Adlestein. Mr. Adlestein is a philosophy author and Emergent Ventures Grant winner, which is awarded by a program organized by the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, which Bryan is also affiliated with. He writes at the Bentham's Bulldog Substack, which now boasts over 1.8 thousand subscribers. There he covers issues such as the defense of utilitarianism, the case for ethical veganism, the existence of souls, the case against physicalism, and the arguments for God's existence, from fine-tuning, psychophysical harmony, a priori knowledge, and human anthropics. Our debate will unfold in several stages over the next hour. The first 15 minutes belongs to Matthew Adlestein, who will deliver an opening statement. After that, Bryan Caplan will be presented with an opportunity to speak for maybe 5 to 10 minutes, however much time he wants to take, and then we'll move into a back and forth period where it'll be lightly moderated. Either person can ask the other a question, and I'm thinking these two fine gentlemen won't need any interventions from me, but we'll see, it might get heated. And with that, Matthew Adlestein will give his opening statement. 15 minutes on the clock. There you go, if you want that one.
And if people would like to follow along with my opening statement, if you type into Google Bentham's newsletter, go to the first result, you should be able to find it. Okay. My goal this afternoon is to make the case that a perfectly good, all-knowing, and all-powerful God exists. The arguments that I will defend will be squarely in the realm of philosophy, where every one of them is taken seriously by a significant number of philosophers. I will defend four main contentions in order to make this case. First, the hypothesis that God exists is very initially probable before we look at any particular evidence, because it is exceedingly simple and lacks arbitrary limits. Second, God is the best explanation of why rational, conscious persons exist. Third, God is the best explanation of how it could be that we know objective facts about right and wrong, good and bad, and that the future will resemble the past. Fourth and finally, God is the best explanation of why you and I in particular exist, out of all the possible people that could have existed. My first contention, then, is that theism, the existence of God, is an intrinsically probable theory. In general, we should prefer theories that are more intrinsically probable. An intrinsically probable theory is a theory that is probable even before we look at specific evidence. For instance, if a person gets a lot of royal flushes in poker, we should think that they're cheating, even though the hypothesis that they got lucky over and over again can explain the data, because the cheating hypothesis is more initially likely. Simpler theories are more initially plausible because they make fewer claims and consequently have fewer ways to go wrong. The theory that the simplicity of string theory, for instance, in physics is one reason why it was taken seriously by so many physicists. But God is an extremely simple hypothesis. Rather than, as naturalists do, positing that fundamental reality has a variety of different, disunified fundamental particles and laws and constants, it posits just one fundamental thing in order to explain all of reality, namely perfection, unlimited goodness, God just has one single property, the property of being perfect. God is like number infinity. He is simple not in that he's easy to understand, but in his ontological nature. After all, when you say something, goodness does not break down into simpler units. It's fundamental. When you say that something is good, you're not describing the natural features of the thing, like how much it weighs or what color it is. So because goodness is fundamental, positing the existence of God is one of the simplest things you can posit. It involves believing that one of the simplest conceivable things simply exists without limit. Furthermore, it is simpler to believe that an infinite amount of a fundamental thing exists than to believe that some random, arbitrary, finite amount of it exists because it lacks an arbitrary limit. A being of unlimited goodness is more likely than a being of limited goodness, just like there being no speed of light is more initially probable than the speed of light being some specific value. Finally, God is ontologically unique, anything unlike anything else, pure being itself. Because of his uniqueness, he's not just one specific way reality could be, like some specific view of physics. He's some much more fundamental thing. On theism, God isn't just another being among many in reality, but reality is fundamentally dependent on God. Because God either exists or doesn't, and theism is a radically unique hypothesis, unlike anything else, the hypothesis that there is a God starts out initially intrinsically probable. Either reality stems from God or it stems from something limited. These are the only two options, and it would be dogmatic to claim that either starts out on vastly superior footing. If theism and atheism are radically different views into the fundamental nature of reality, you shouldn't think either starts out much likelier than the other. You should just look at the evidence, at which makes better sense of the world. I claim that it is theism that makes better sense of the world. My second contention, then, is that God does a better job of explaining why rational, conscious persons exist. Just like getting a bunch of good hands in poker is evidence that I'm cheating, because it's likely if I'm cheating, but unlikely if I'm not cheating. The existence of conscious persons is good evidence for God, because they're very likely if God exists, but unlikely if God doesn't exist. Naturalism, the view that all that exists is the natural world, has no special reason built into it for predicting conscious people to exist. After all, there are infinitely many ways the world could have gone that would have satisfied naturalism without involving interesting things of value happening. On the other hand, if we suppose that a perfectly good God exists, we have a specific reason to expect the world to contain valuable and interesting things, like conscious persons, which are a prerequisite for anything good to happen. Indeed, the naturalist account requires accepting the following series of unlikely events, none of which are intrinsically predicted by the theory. First, there have to be many basic physical things, like bosons and fermions, that could very well have not existed. Second, there have to be laws governing the behavior of those physical things, even though the physical things could have existed without governing laws. Given that laws could have existed without the physical stuff, or the physical stuff without the laws, it's odd that they both exist at the same time. This is especially so because a world without laws is much simpler. 3, then the laws have to apply to the physical things. For example, we might have laws governing how fermions move, but not have there be any fermions. But this did not have to be the case. There could be laws, but the laws wouldn't apply to the things that happen to exist. It's therefore miraculous that the laws that govern behavior precisely line up with the things that do exist. It would be like coming across a random game board, finding a random rulebook, and discovering that the rulebook just happens to apply to the game. On top of this, the fundamental laws have to be capable of making the fundamental things work together. But this is far from a guarantee. Perhaps there could be fermions that only interact with bosons, but no bosons. So the fermions just sit around doing nothing. That's overwhelmingly more likely than any interaction between the things in the universe, because the overwhelming majority of possible laws would be inapplicable, just like only a small percentage of possible rules can apply to any particular pieces in the game. 4, then the laws have to be able to generate complexity. Unfortunately, the overwhelming majority of possible laws do not generate complexity, as Luke Barnes has shown. John Conway made something called the Game of Life, which you can find online, which makes interesting things happen from simple arrangements of dots. But he had to search through and reject tons of rules because nearly all fundamental rules don't result in anything interesting happening. If you just made a random simple law to govern simple stuff, it would almost surely do nothing interesting. Chaos is much likelier than order. For example, suppose that all particles just moved in a straight line until they hit each other and then bounced off in a random direction. Or suppose they all moved in a circle at 1 mile per hour, or 2, or 3, or 4. All of those are much simpler than the laws of our universe. If the laws were like that, then nothing interesting would arise. Almost all possible simple laws are like that. In fact, there are an infinite number of laws that are simpler than those in our world, so we just happen to get one of the very few possible sets of laws that would produce anything interesting when perhaps only 0% of total laws do that. 5, even once the laws are roughly like ours, we have to get extremely lucky with the constants. The constants of physics are how strong the laws are, for instance, how strong gravity is. If you modify many of the constants of physics even slightly, nothing interesting could arise. No atoms, and certainly no complex life. If the cosmological constant was weaker or stronger, or if gravity was weaker or stronger, even if they were only slightly weaker or stronger. This is well agreed upon among those who have studied it. As the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy notes, quote, the initial entropy of the universe must have been exceedingly low. According to Penrose, universes resembling the one in which we live populate only 1 part in 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 123 of the available phase space volume. Stephen Weinberg says the cosmological constant has to be fine-tuned to 1 part in 10 to the power of 120, which means that if it were weaker or stronger by 1 part in 10 to the power of 120 units, the universe would have fizzled. 6. Then on top of this, you have to have consciousness. Consciousness is very mysterious. It seems like consciousness points to some reality beyond the visible. Consciousness isn't just about the behavior of matter, because even after you know how all atoms move, you don't know what's being consciously experienced. But if you grant this broad picture, you next have to suppose that there are laws that give rise to consciousness. 7. Then after that, there have to be the physical things that generate consciousness. This is far from guaranteed. We know that brains give rise to consciousness, but you still have to have brains to have consciousness. What are the odds that there would both be laws that say that brains give rise to consciousness, and then also that there would happen to be brains? 8. Then after that, you have the laws that give rise to harmonious consciousness. You can imagine there being laws that make our desires have no causal effects. So that when you want to raise your arm, nothing happens. Or that your mental model of what's going on in reality is wildly inaccurate. It's lucky that the consciousness laws give rise to rich, complex consciousness, where we can interact meaningfully in the world. Each step along the way is very improbable, yet the naturalist has to accept that all of them occur. There are 8 steps, so even if we assume conservatively that each one has a 1 in 10 chance of occurring, this still means the odds of them occurring is 1 in 10 million. Betting on naturalism, then, is like a presumptuous gambler predicting that he'll get lucky over and over again. Let's compare the explanations. The theist thinks that there are agents because God wants there to be, because agents are the only things of value. The naturalist thinks there just happen to be, for no further reason, physical stuff, the laws to govern it, the laws applied to the stuff that existed, the laws were able to generate complexity, the constants were finely tuned, then there were psychophysical laws that gave rise to consciousness, then there was the stuff that generated consciousness in combination with the psychophysical laws, and then they happen to be one of the dimensionally small portion of laws that are psychophysically harmonious. My third contention, then, is that atheism struggles to explain certain types of knowledge, in particular, moral knowledge. To know things about some subject, there has to be a relationship between one's knowledge and the facts themselves. I can know there's a table on the basis of seeing it because the table explains why I see it. However, if I hallucinated a table, and I knew that, I wouldn't be justified in believing that there was a table on the basis of seeing it, because there would be no connection between my observation of the table and the table itself. But the moral facts can't make the difference to a purely mechanical process like the movement of atoms. Therefore, in atheism, we wouldn't expect to have moral knowledge. To have moral knowledge, one needs a special non-physical faculty of intuition that directly interacts with the moral facts that atheism struggles to explain. Now, even if you don't believe in moral knowledge, other problems exist in this vicinity. For example, atheism struggles to justify induction. Induction is when you draw inferences about the future from the past. For example, inferring that the sun will rise tomorrow on the basis that it's always risen tomorrow, or in the past rather. In order to justify induction, you must think that worlds where the future resembles the past are inherently more likely than ones where it radically deviates from the past. Otherwise, our inferences about the past give us no reason to think the future will be similar. But facts about the inherent likeliness of various worlds are not physical facts, and as such, we can't draw justified inferences about them on atheism unless you posit this very unlikely non-physical faculty of reliable intuition. My last argument, then, is that theism, the existence of God, best explains why you, in particular, exist. Suppose that God exists. We then expect God to create every possible person. God is maximally good and would do the best thing, so creating someone is good if you can give them a good life, which God can do, and so God would be expected to create all possible people. This means that if theism is true, then it would be guaranteed that you in particular would exist, because every possible person would exist. In contrast, if atheism is true, it's very unlikely that you exist. The number of possible people was shown to be Beth 2 by David Lewis. Beth 2 is a very large infinite. Some infinites are larger than others. Beth 0 is the smallest infinite. Beth 1 is bigger than that. And Beth 2 is bigger than that. No atheist, so Beth 2 is a really big infinity, and no atheist has ever had a plausible view on which there are Beth 2 people that exist. Even if the universe is infinitely big, for example, or even if there's an infinite multiverse, that would still only have Beth 0 people, which is 0% of Beth 2. So then on atheism, only 0% of possible people would exist, which makes my existence, in particular, extremely improbable. Now, I know you're thinking, to the extent that theism predicts that all possible people would exist, where are all the people? Where are all the infinite possible people that allegedly exist? Well, the claim isn't that they all exist in this universe. The claim is that they all exist somewhere. So God would create a vast theistic multiverse, could create a vast universe, and put a vast multiverse, and put everyone in the universe that's best for their moral and spiritual development. The argument is a little bit complicated, so let's be clear on the structure. You exist, your existence is more likely if more people exist, just like any particular number is more likely to be drawn from a hat if more total numbers are drawn from a hat. So from the fact that you exist, you get infinitely strong evidence that every possible person exists. Atheism has no plausible story of why every possible person would exist, while theism naturally predicts that every possible person would exist. Bryan and I are both in agreement that it's good to create a possible person. It's good to create a person if you could give them a good life. And so God, as the ultimate pro-natalist, would create every possible person. And so, see, Bryan wrote a book called Selfish Reasons to Have More Kids. So if you combine God plus Bryan's reasoning and selfish reasons to have more kids, you get the conclusion that there would be a vast theistic multiverse. So now, why I think that the existence of more people is more likely than that you exist? Note that this conclusion is not just accepted by theists. In fact, it's primarily accepted by atheist philosophers, like Kenneth Ohlum and Joe Carl Smith. There are many reasons for this view, let me sketch just two. First, it follows from the straightforward probabilistic reasoning I did before. If there are more people, it's likelier that I'd be one of them, just like if there are more numbers drawn from a hat, the odds that any particular number would be drawn from a hat are higher. Secondly, if you deny this, you get absurd results. For instance, if you get the result that the world will probably end soon, because if a universe with more people is no more likely to have me, while a universe with fewer people guarantees that I'd be earlier in the universe, then I should think that the universe won't last long. This is called the doomsday argument, and can be shown to follow from any view that says that that denies that more people existing is more likely. From this, one can get even crazier results. Imagine that Adam and Eve are the first two people and are considering having sex, but they don't know they're the first two people. So they reason in the following way. If the first two people have lots of offspring, then it's very unlikely that we'd be the first two people, because we could be any of the many offspring. Suddenly, God informs them that they're the first two people. Now, because they're the first two people, and that's very unlikely if the first two people have many offspring, they get extremely strong evidence that the first people will not have many offspring, and consequently, that they won't have many offspring. Thus, they can be confident that, for instance, if God tells them that he'll make any offspring from them, unless they get a royal flesh and liver, that they will get a royal flesh, because they've already gotten super strong evidence that they won't have many offspring. But clearly, this is crazy. So the challenge is this. The arguments I've given show that one should think every possible person gets created, because only that makes it likely that you or I in particular would get created out of the uncountably infinite possible people that there could be. So if only a few billion or trillion or even a small infinite number of people get created, the odds that you in particular would exist would be zero. What is the atheist view on which every possible person gets created? And I submit there is no possible atheistic view on which that's true. In summary then, I've argued that theism is initially probable because of its simplicity, absence of arbitrary limits, and ontological uniqueness, its explanation of the existence of conscious agents, the explanation of moral knowledge, and its explanation of why you in particular exist out of a vast panoply of possible people. Unless there are similarly strong reasons to accept atheism, I submit theism is the more rational option. Just as one should believe in evolution because it explains a wide variety of otherwise puzzling facts about biology, one should believe theism because it best explains almost everything about the world. So thanks for listening, everyone. Thanks to Bryan for doing the debate, and thanks Jonah for setting this up.
Can I have that?
Yes.
And with that, we have Matthew Adlestein's opening statement, and we'll now move to an opening statement from Bryan Caplan. Bryan Caplan, you can take the stage. And just as a note going forward, Matthew, when you're speaking into the mic, try to keep it like around here.
Okay.
Don't bring it really close or it gets really loud. Okay. Sorry. It's okay.
Thank you very much. Jonah didn't speak to something that might be on your mind. Why is an economist debating the existence of God at all? The answer is when I was 17, this was all I wanted to talk about. It's the only issue, and I tried to make everyone talk to me about it. Anyway, so I have done quite a bit of blogging. I don't have any publications on the existence of God, unless you're going to count blog posts and publications. But still, I'm going to tell you what I think. I'll just start. So I think Matthew is great, but all his arguments are bad. All right, so let's just go through the arguments one by one. If you're feeling a little hazy on what the arguments were, why don't I just back up? Okay, so Matthew had these 4 arguments. I'm I'm not going to have time to go over every sub-argument. I'm just going to try to hit the high points, and then when we're talking with each other, we can go over them. Right, starting off, number one, God's existence is initially plausible. Now, did everybody catch Matthew's definition of God? Perfect being, so I assume that gives us omnipotence, omniscience, omnibenevolence, all those things, right? All right, so all-powerful, all-knowing, all good. All right, now why is it not even remotely plausible that such a person would exist? There's a bunch of arguments that have been around for thousands of years, but I'll just repeat them. Let's see, the problem of evil. Why are things not awesome if there is an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good being? Why do any of us suffer? Why do we die? Why is there sorrow? Come on. All right, this is a great argument. The great Epicurus made it 2,500 years ago. Matthew says that it's been heavily questioned. I'd say this is about as good of an argument as you're ever going to get in philosophy. Look around and see all of the imperfection and say, well, yeah, why didn't this infinitely great guy make everything infinitely great? And the obvious answer, yeah, because he doesn't exist. All right. The only stories that really make any sense here are something like Manichaeism, where you've got a good God and an evil God, and they're fighting with each other, or as the Gnostics believe, there is a all-powerful evil being who's making people suffer. Even there, it's like, well, he's not making us suffer infinitely, so it's like an intermediate, it's like a morally gray, infinitely powerful being. But anyway, that's not Matthew's God. All right, so the problem of evil is one really big one. Here's another one. Here's something I think is way more initially plausible. There is an incredibly it's not an infinitely powerful being. Here's my alternate initially plausible theory. What you see is what you get. Are you familiar with what you see is what you get fonts on a computer? What you see is what you get. It's printed on the screen. It looks exactly that way. I say this is actually the simplest theory. The things that we look around and see exist, whether it's with our eyes or with just introspection, that stuff is real, right? And other stuff, yeah, it's imagination, right? Does Mordor exist? No. J.R.R. Tolkien created it in his imagination. But do you know what it means to be created in imagination? It means to not actually be created at all. You're not really there. It's just something somebody's thinking about. Yeah, so God's existence is not initially plausible at all. There's also the classic argument of, show yourself to me, O great one! Where are you? Show you yourself! How hard would it have been for the infinitely powerful, all-knowing, infinitely good God to have just shown up in a way no one could ever doubt and just reveal himself, settling the question for all time? Well, since he's infinitely powerful, it would have been infinitely easy. But it hasn't happened, right? And so that's pretty weird, so not initially plausible. All right, then we've got the second argument. God explains why conscious persons exist. This is a more specific version, a more elaborate version. It's called the fine-tuning argument, which just says, look, we look at the constants of science. What are the odds they would be just so? Right now, one thing that I do actually work on is statistics and probability. So Matthew has what I consider some very odd views about probability, actually. All right, so here's the thing. So, well, what are the odds that something that has been repeatedly observed to be exactly the same in an incredible range of circumstances, what are the odds that thing could change? You mean like a scientific constant? What are the odds that a scientific constant has been measured very carefully, millions of times, in millions of different situations? What are the odds that could change? Yeah, darn slim. That's the definition of a scientific constant. If someone came along and said, I've got an experiment where the scientific constant is different from what the textbooks say, you said, wow, it's amazing. Yeah, it's more than amazing. It's preposterous. It's like, who are you? Now, if a Nobel Prize winner in a team with other Nobel Prize winners found some problem, then you're like, huh, maybe some slight chance they found an error, even they're more likely that they just made a mistake. Right? But I'll just bring this up. So what would count as evidence that something couldn't have been different if not for the fact that it's been observed in a wide variety of circumstances, a vast number of times, to be exactly the same, down to as many decimal places that people can measure? So I will say that actually Matthew's use of probability is wrong. Like, you need to go and take a look and say, well, like, if I didn't know anything, what would the odds be? And then we'll say, yeah, it's a really hard question to ask. Or even, it's a hard question to ask, even harder to answer. But once we do actually have very careful evidence that something's a scientific constant, then saying, hey, maybe it could be different. It's like, yeah, why should we think it could be different? Why not think it just had to be that way? His specific numbers about how they measured things down to 1 in 100, 1 in 10 to 120, that's all ridiculous because none of the stuff has ever been measured to that level. So to say that it can't, that if it were different to that level, the world, the universe wouldn't exist, we haven't measured it to that level. So, therefore, there must be a wide range, wider than 1 in 10 to 120, that could actually still work. Because we don't actually know what the values of those constants are at that many decimal places. All right, let's see. All right, and then, so that's the general fine-tuning argument, and then a specific one about what are the odds that there would be consciousness. As you can guess, and I have a pretty similar story there. It's like, well, given that we have conscious beings, it's actually super likely that you would get consciousness. And then to say, well, I'm going to get credit for something that we already know about as proof of my theory, yeah, again, that's not the way that things actually work. You may have heard that there's a very important principle in science, which is that you've got to predict things before you observe them in order to get credit for having a great insight. Yeah, there's a reason for that. Like, if Albert Einstein had first measured whatever it was about Mercury, and then he said, this is exactly what my theory predicted, people would have just laughed at it, and they should. You've got to say what the theory predicts before you know the facts if you want to get credit, because anybody can go and claim that they get credit for stuff that everybody knows about. So it really counts for very little and should count for very little. What is the atheistic explanation for consciousness? Well, a lot of it's evolution. Right? And you say, well, evolution says that life will exist and that things that are around will tend to be around and be able to reproduce and so on. Sure, it does say that, but it's not such a hard problem. Just in particular, consider the things that you're really good at doing unconsciously, like beating your heart. All right, yeah. All kinds of idiot animals are able to do that. Now think about the things that you're good at doing that you need your conscious thinking, like listening to a debate. All right, wow. Yeah, that requires a lot of extra effort. Now, why would your ability to do that kind of thing evolve? Well, some problems are especially complicated and difficult, and just acting on instinct doesn't work very well for them. And for that, conscious thought would be helpful. It's like, well, do we get conscious thought just as helpful? No. Rather, the way evolution works, you may recall, is the things that lack the really helpful thing tend to die out, and the things that have the helpful thing tend to survive. If someone pushes you off a cliff, it would be really helpful to grow wings, but you won't, you'll just die. But over time, however, over a long period of time, the fact that there's a survival advantage to being able to fly does give us creatures that can fly through usual evolutionary mechanisms. Right, then we've got the God explains moral knowledge story, and actually you might remember that at the end he said it also explains how we can have learning from experience. I've got to say that it sounds like we've got a really circular argument here, where we start off by going and using induction, because that's a lot of what he's doing, and then saying, oh yeah, by the way, we also need my theory to explain the very thing we're doing. Yeah, that's circular, so that's not a really good feature of an argument. What would be another explanation why we have moral knowledge or why we have epistemic knowledge? It's like, well, here is a general story. Right? Evolution designs us to go and be able to figure out things that are actually practical for our survival. But when it does that, it actually winds up giving us faculties that we've used for other things. Right? It's like, why? Well, like once you get this faculty for conscious reasoning to figure out how to avoid getting murdered by other cavemen and how to murder other cavemen and that kind of thing, well, once you have that, you can also start saying, who created the universe? Well, maybe nobody did. Right? Once you've got this capacity for conscious reasoning, you can go and apply it to other areas. You can use your eyes to study the stars, even though actual studying the stars is not very practical for survival. Right? Anyone here, how many constellations can you even identify? It's like, all right, well, look up there and see the stars. Some people have gone and used their minds to go and figure out stuff about this totally practical thing. So once you see how having a faculty will allow you to go and figure out things that are otherwise not practical survival, it's not such a big puzzle either. All right, now we come to this last argument. This last one I'll say is craziest arguments I've ever heard in the entire history of philosophy. I've been talking philosophy for decades. I'm not going to say this is the craziest, but it's in the top 10. Right? God explains why you in particular exist out of all possible people. My initial reaction is, well, but whoever I was, it would explain it. So how is that even an argument if whatever we observe, we get the same answer? Again, that's a basic principle in probability, that if you get the same thing whatever you observe, the evidence is not really actually driving the conclusion, it's just your starting point. All right. Now, I'll just go to the middle of Matthew's argument, where he says, okay, well, God explains why you exist, which then shows that there have to be an infinite number of people, and then where are the infinite people? And then it turns out it's the multiverse. All right. What's another way we could think about this? If we buy his argument, God predicts that an infinite number of people will exist, an infinite number of people don't exist, therefore God doesn't exist. That's the much more natural way to go through the argument here. All this stuff about the multiverse and everything else, all right, now we've got to accept giant, weird metaphysics that has been ruining movies in the last few years. I guess it doesn't make it wrong, but it's definitely unaesthetic. What else can we say about this? Let's see. There was one other thing I wanted to say about all of the possible people existing. Let's see. So the particular measure of infinity that's getting used, again, this is one where if you go into probability theory, be like, well, yeah, like, how do we even break it down? What even counts as a different person existing? If we just cut it into a large enough number of parts, then we can get infinity to be as large as you want. And when you think about it more, it's like, what does that really show? I remember when I was also around 17, thinking about the existence of God. Sometimes I get the sense of existential awe saying that I'm the only person in the universe sitting in this bedroom, reading this particular book, listening to this particular piece of music, while also having those 3 particular books stacked on their dresser. Right? And if you just add on additional conditions, you can turn any seemingly mundane event into a seemingly infinitely improbable event, which makes sense until you realize that every single event still defines infinitely improbable. So it's something that's happened, so why not this? All right, so I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Let's see.
I thought we were going to use the... Can everyone hear that?
Okay, that'll be yours, and this is...
Bryan, do you accept that Alexander the Great exists?
Yes.
Okay, so you asserted that...
Well, it existed. It doesn't exist now.
That's true, yeah. So
But see, this isn't like a multiverse character or anything.
no, good. Well, so you accepted... You said
Bryan, can you move in a little closer, actually? Sorry. I can't see you on the camera. No, can Bryan move in a little bit? Move to that chair. Sorry.
So you say that...
Am I good now?
Yeah, you're good now.
So you say that in order for something to count as evidence for another theory, you have to make the prediction in advance. Is any of the things that are used as evidence for the existence of Alexander the Great, like written records of him and gold coins, was any of that predicted in advance?
Yeah. I'm specifically referring to a scientific theory where you get a lot more credit. And this didn't say you get no credits, because obviously you get a theory where it doesn't imply the facts after the fact. But I'm saying you do get a lot more credit. Now, something where there's a lot of other evidence for it, you can say, well, all right, fine, this particular piece of evidence I have, it's not really adding much to the case. On the other hand, if you do have a story where what you're saying is controversial, then yeah, it really helps if you say it in advance. You don't wait until the newspaper headline comes on and say, that's exactly what my theory predicted. My theory predicted Hamas would attack on October 7th. Gee, you should have told us before October 7th if that was your theory.
Okay, you agree that we can get strong evidence for a theory from the fact that it adequately explains past events, like the fact that the existence of Alexander the Great well explains why there are gold coins of him and why people wrote that.
That's some of the evidence. It's not, I wouldn't say that itself is strong because you have coins of Hercules on it. It doesn't show Hercules existed.
Right, well, so there can be cases
What I'll say is the totality of evidence for Alexander is very strong. Yeah, again, I would say that in the case of Alexander the Great, we just have a giant pile of very particular pieces of evidence.
Okay,
So
your claim is you agree that the evidence is in principle permissible, you just think there isn't enough.
Yes, and then the flip side is, could the existence of God be like the existence of the evidence for the existence of Alexander the Great? It could be, it's just not.
Okay.
Right? Because the evidence that we have for God is consistent with almost anything, according to the evidence you've offered. In fact, it's not. In fact, it goes stronger, like I said. The existence of evil is strong evidence God doesn't exist. And every day more evil happens, and that's further evidence He doesn't exist.
You think the existence of evil is strong evidence that God doesn't exist. Did you predict that in advance and then later observe evil?
No, like I said, I didn't say that you get zero credit.
Okay,
What I did say, rather, is that you get a lot less credit if you wait until after the fact.
Yeah, I'd be happy to admit that you get a lot less credit. But just if there's enough evidence, then even if you get less credit, then it still counts.
Right, but this is a case where we've got a pile of evidence against. And so, if it was just one bad thing that happened, it's like, what does that show God doesn't exist? And I'm sure you know the classic defenses of, well, look, it might seem like that really horrible thing shows that God doesn't exist, but you understand all the other good things that happen as a result of that thing happening. Like Jesus being tortured to death on a cross, that thing gave incredible hope and comfort and saved the world and saved all these souls, so you're wrong, that thing doesn't count. And it's like, even that's a little fishy, because why couldn't He just save people without going and making one person die? Why couldn't He make it work that way? But, yeah, when you have a ton of stuff that's happening bad all the time, and it's really hard for anyone to come up with any remotely plausible story about why it needs to exist for some greater good, then yeah, evidence against.
Obviously, the laws like gravity being different would be inconsistent with the physical laws, but you would at least agree that it's logically possible for laws like the law of gravity to be different.
Yes, it's logically possible, it just doesn't show we should assign more than a negligible probability.
Okay, well, I mean, that's
just like it's logically possible this is all hallucination, but we shouldn't give that more than a very tiny probability.
Well, so generally in assessing, when you're assessing how much evidence counts for some theory, what you'll do is you'll look at the evidence, you'll look at how likely the evidence would be if all you knew was that one theory is true versus if all you knew was that the other theory is true. Do you agree that if all that you knew was that there was no God, you would assign the odds that the constants fall in narrow life-permitting range? You would assign that a low probability.
Well, given that I exist in this hypothetical wrong.
Well, you're
so you have to ask me, if I didn't exist at all, what would I do? Like, what would a non-existent person think? It's an incoherent question.
Well, I mean, you're not, when assigning priors, you're supposed to sort of like, not think about that.
I can't help it.
Yeah, so imagine that all the atoms said in very small font, made by God. Would that be good evidence for the existence of God?
I'd say it'd be good evidence for the existence of nanotech.
Okay, if all the atoms, even on faraway galaxies, that are not plausibly explained by human nanotech, would that be good evidence for the existence of God?
Yeah, it'd be difficult. I'd say that it's plausibly explained by some other species nanotech. Aliens are a lot more likely than this guy we're talking about.
Okay, so maybe you still wouldn't believe in God, but you would not even agree that that would be reasonable evidence for God? Is there anything that could be evidence for God in your view?
Yeah, like everything being awesome all the time, that would be really good evidence. Or, how about some seemingly super powerful beings appearing before all humanity to be filmed by our cameras, and then He lets all of the skeptics go and say, do this, do that, and He said, and his only reason not to is, sorry, that wouldn't be all good, I can't go and disintegrate your enemies. But it's like, okay, how about you make the world's the cutest bunny rabbit that ever existed? And he's like, I see no possible problem. Bunny rabbit of infinite cuteness.
And can you explain why that would be evidence for God?
Yeah, because that would be the kind of thing that no one else in history has ever done anything remotely close, and it's something that your definition of God would be able to do. I would still, honestly, if I were there, I would still say maybe it's just a really powerful alien. He hasn't really shown infinity, he's shown superpowers, which is great, and I appreciate the bunny, but...
Okay, so if you think even in the case where God appears before you, declares Himself to be God, sends a loud, booming voice from the heavens that says God exists, or something like that, you still wouldn't believe in God?
Raise the probability and still say it's a lot more likely it's just a super powerful alien.
Well, so if you start by being essentially certain of the view, and then don't consider the evidence carefully, even if it's thousands of times more strongly predicted on one hypothesis than the other, that's a recipe for dogmatism and for essentially never changing your view. Because you can always come up with some alternative explanation.
I'm not saying it's coming up with a weird alternative explanation. I'm saying coming up with a the much more likely one, which is much more likely that there's an infinitely powerful being or that there's super powerful aliens.
Well, I think
I say, like, super powerful aliens seems almost certain there's some super powerful aliens somewhere. It's an enormous universe.
Yeah.
On the other hand, infinitely powerful, that's like, is that even coherent? It's not clear that it is, whereas being incredibly powerful is coherent anyway.
Yeah, well, so why is being infinitely powerful not coherent?
Well, let's see. Here again, we go back to a bunch of classic arguments in the history of philosophy. If God is infinite, could of all powerful, could he make a rock so heavy even he couldn't lift it? Right? And that's the kind of thing where it's like,
well,
maybe there's an answer to that, but it at least seems like maybe the real story is that the idea of the God just doesn't make any sense.
And there's an answer to it that's been agreed upon by almost all theologians for the past several thousand years, which is that what it means to be infinitely powerful is that you can do anything that is logically possible. So the ability to create square circles, or the ability to create a thing so powerful that so heavy that not even an infinitely powerful being can create it. That's not a limit on your power, right? Infinite power is just the ability there not being anything that you can't do for lack of strength. There are things you can do.
It seems like a limit on your power to say that logic binds you. You could say, theologians have generally gone to this. I would say probably most theologians would actually be totally stumped by this argument and wouldn't know what to say. If you're only going to say the true theologians are only the ones that know so much they can give this argument,
I think you're understanding the theologians.
Most of them are mediocre, but most of them are basically like the adjunct professors of their day.
Bryan,
right? No offense to the adjuncts here, but
why is it? So you say that the presence of evil is strong evidence that God doesn't exist. But you
your version again. We can talk about the Gnostic God of the evil God, the morally gray God.
I'm talking about that. So you agree that that's strong evidence that God doesn't exist, but you don't think that the presence of various good things that are extremely improbable that's strong evidence that God doesn't exist. What's the reason for the asymmetry?
Yeah. So I would say again that we take a look at the world and we see much evil and much good, which would be either consistent with the morally gray God or maybe like the bipolar God, or just there's no actual person that we're being that is trying to make things one way or the other, and it's just natural laws and evolution.
So the reason is because if there was a God, you would think the odds of things being pretty mixed and there being all these bad things are much lower if there's a God or on the hypothesis that there's a God than on the hypothesis that there isn't a God. So now, couldn't someone argue in the same way that the odds that there would be all these conscious agents is much lower on the hypothesis that there's no God than on the hypothesis that there is, so that you have to go through these 8 different probable steps, none of which are particularly probable, each of which require constants falling in this extremely narrow range.
Yeah, again, you're doing that thing where you're saying that things are improbable after we already know that they've happened. Which is not absolutely crazy in all cases, but it's highly unconvincing and should be highly unconvincing. Like, what are the odds that there would be 5 people at Vanderbilt who would want to hear a debate about the existence of God today? Well, looking around this room, I'm going to go up to near 100%. Always, this philosophy club stating a very tiny sliver of probability for hallucinations and dreams.
Yeah. Well, it actually is true that the odds that all these lovely people would be here at exactly this moment are extremely low. The thing is,
after you see them, they're still low.
Well, the prior probability of the prior probability of that happening is low, but there isn't a better theory that explains it, because any theory that predicts this data specifically will have a similarly low prior probability because it's so specific. In cases where there's an event that has a low prior probability and it occurs, and there's a theory that naturally explains it, then we do normally infer that that hypothesis occurs. For instance, if we see a person get royal flush after royal flush in poker, which is a very low probability, we ordinarily infer that the deck of cards was rigged in some way, because even though you could say, look, it had to turn out some way. Of course, it had to turn out some way, but the odds it would in fact turn out a way where one side keeps getting royal flushes are much higher on the hypothesis that they're rigging it than on the hypothesis that they are not.
Yeah. Again, of course, you keep thinking that the universe is like a game of cards, where we know that the probabilities could be easily really different, and that's precisely what we should not think. Like I said, actually here, I'll ask you a question. So, what would we have to observe in the real world for you to say that thing is not reasonable to think that it could be otherwise?
Well, I think that the way we figure out which things are possible is not primarily through empirical observation. So the
All right, so that's why I would disagree and say that it's really important to observe the world to figure out what's possible.
Well, I think
right? So if something has been observed many, many times in many circumstances by people of high reliability, it's been found to be the same measurement to many decimal places over and over, the right conclusion is that thing must be as it is.
Yeah,
It's a scientific constant, it doesn't change.
Well, so observing that something is the same thing over and over again, that tells you that it is the case and that it's physically impossible for it to change, perhaps, but it doesn't tell you that it's logically impossible for it to change. So, for instance, the way we know that you can't have contradictions, you couldn't have a married bachelor, you couldn't have someone who's married and unmarried at the same time. We know that not because we've never observed a married bachelor. There are lots of things that we've never observed but that are impossible in principle because we can see by reflecting on what a contradiction is that you can't have it. And so in a similar way, you figure out what actually is the case by consulting the real world, but the way you figure out what's possible is not by consulting the real world.
Yeah. So once you remember that people make logical errors, the fact that you have logically proven that something is true isn't a probability one anymore. So you might say maybe the very, very simplest, most straightforward arithmetic or logical truths are known with certainty, like 1 + 1 = 2. But if you were adding up a large column of numbers that were big with decimals and someone said you made a mistake, would you say logic dictates that I'm correct? You'd say, no, I guess there's some probability that I'm wrong, and that's a reason to go and redo the calculations. And I'll say that once you do that, you realize that arguments of logical necessity are really actually in the same category as what you call a physical impossibility, where it's like, well, both cases we can make a mistake, both cases the probabilities are really high, both cases, if we're totally honest, they're not literally 1.000 out to infinity.
Yeah, when you say something's logically impossible or logically necessary, you're not making a claim about how confident you can be in it. So, for example, there's a mathematical theorem that has not been proved in either direction called Goldbach's conjecture. We don't know if it's true or false, but nonetheless, whether it's true or false is not something that depends on the facts of the world. What it means to say something's logically possible is not that you know it with certainty, but that it can't be otherwise. And so if something can't
yes, would you agree that people almost always equivocate between those two things?
Well, I think you were equivocating between those two things a few moments ago.
No, I'm just using it the normal way.
Yeah, I was referring to metaphysical possibility, right? So do you agree that the laws being different is metaphysically possible? In that the laws, not in the law that, based on the laws we've seen, we obviously know that they are not in fact different. But do you agree that the laws could have been different?
In a relevant sense. It doesn't, metaphysical possibility is just barely an extra piece tweak upon what we know. If I could have physical possibility, if I knew something was physically certain or physically impossible, and then someone said, but you also know that it's metaphysically impossible, and say, all right, well, maybe not, but what difference does it really make? If it's physically impossible, then it is actually literally correct to say it can't be otherwise, and there's no probability of being otherwise, and then all of the arguments, at least most of the arguments you're making, just don't make any sense.
Yeah, well, so so if we assume that, so if metaphysical possibility and physical possibility are different things, whether or not one cares about the difference between the two is a different story, but if they are different things, and the way you calculate, like, if things turn out in a way, if there are lots of ways that are metaphysically possible for a thing to turn out, and it happens to turn out one way, then we often infer that there's some explanation for that, if that's a very improbable way for them to turn out, and if the alternative to them turning out that way, if it's very improbable that they turn out that way in general, but there's one theory that explains very well why they turn out that way. So for instance, if we, back to the card case, if we see a person get royal flush after royal flush, it makes sense to infer, it wouldn't do to say, look, it was, yes, this person got 5 royal flushes in their last 5 games of poker, but it was physically impossible for it to be anything otherwise, given the way the particles in fact turn out, they couldn't have gotten anything else. Nonetheless, we would still say that's evidence of cheating, because the physical laws turning out that way are much better explained on the theory that they're cheating than on the theory that they're not.
All right, so let's just go to the connection between probability and metaphysical possibility. Right. So you're telling me, of course, that those are different things. All right, so how about you just grant me that it is physically necessary that the gravitational constant is what it is, right?
Yeah.
Is it physically necessary?
Yeah, it's physically necessary.
Okay, so if it's physically necessary, then doesn't it follow that the probability that it has to at least be consistency with very close range of where we measured it is 1.
Okay, physical necessity is consistency with the laws of physics. But the thing we're trying to
Okay,
explain...
hold on. All right, so is the probability that the gravitational constant is, as we have measured it, plus or minus some very small amount, 1 or close to it?
Okay, so we have to be...
Yes or no?
Well,
can I get a yes or no?
It depends on what you mean by probability. There are two different important senses of probability. One is probability before you observe the evidence. One is probability after you observe the evidence. Before you observe the evidence, the prior probability of it is extremely low. The probability, now that we know what the laws of physics are, is of course very high. Just like the prior probability of any particular person getting a bunch of royal flushes in poker is very low, but after a person gets a bunch of royal flushes in poker, the probability after you observe the evidence that they got the royal flushes in poker is very high. And so it's exactly the same with the physical laws. You can't explain why the physical laws as they are by appealing to physical possibility, when physical possibility just is consistency with the physical laws.
But your whole royal flush example is just like a case where it's totally physically possible to get a bunch of different things.
Well, I mean, that'll depend on whether you think, like if you think determinism is right, then it actually, things couldn't have in a physical sense turned out anyway differently from how they did. Right, so if a person says, look, I have this very good theory of why I got so many royal flushes. Necessitarianism is true, so whatever happens couldn't have been otherwise, and it couldn't have been otherwise that I got a bunch of royal flushes. We would all say that's not a good explanation, because even though you can say that, it couldn't have been otherwise in a physical sense, you can still imagine all these different ways of things turning out differently, and so the probability that they would turn out in this very specific way out of the 10 to the 10 to the 123rd power ways that they could be, the way the odds they would be in this very narrow range are extremely low.
Yeah, so I guess I'm just going to go back to that question. What would you have to see in the real world to convince you that some absurd thing had to be what it was?
Well, so I think the evidence for God primarily...
No. Something in the physical world.
Yeah, well...
So something in a textbook, like a regular science textbook, or just daily life.
So if everyone's being tortured all the time, I would not believe in a good God. Now, yeah.
All right. Okay, so, that's interesting in itself, but... I suppose we could go and do a detour to veganism where you've been telling me about how what's happening to animals every day is as bad as the Holocaust, so, alright, so did good God do that?
Yeah, well, so I think you have to look at the broad picture where you have to consider, we only can observe about 7 years of what is on theism, an infinitely long afterlife. And so if you only look at the first 7 years of what's an infinitely long process, just as if you're trying to guess if someone's a good chess player and you only look at the first of infinity moves that they make, you would not have a very good sense of whether they're a good chess player. And similarly... So
it doesn't sound like you're a rinse or something then?
Well, maybe it would have to last for a while, right? If you only
longer than human life?
I don't know exactly how long it would
So, you're not going to encounter that. Look, I would just say just observing that water runs downhill enough times is enough to say, yeah, it's super likely that water runs uphill. That's highly probable, and it's not at all like a royal flush. It's like a deck with nothing except an ace of spades.
Right.
And you keep saying, how could that be? How could that be? I'll show you the whole deck. It's nothing but aces and spades, so that's why it keeps happening.
Yeah, well, so if we had a theory that naturally predicted some outcome of a deck of cards, even though any particular outcome will be low probability, but because it has to turn out one way, any theory that predicts that it will turn out a specific way, most of those theories will be just as improbable as the decks of cards themselves, and so as a result, it doesn't make sense to think that it's rigged. But if you had, if it was this very specific sequence that you have some reason to expect it to be rigged, then you would have a reason to infer rigging. So in terms of your question about whether or not there would be evidence that could convince you, so Bryan, is there evidence that could convince you that your parents did not get pregnant?
Yeah, totally.
Okay.
Maybe I'm adopted.
Okay, is there evidence that could convince you?
I believe in that my mom was the Virgin Mary. That'd be easier to believe. There are animals that actually can reproduce asexually. Maybe my mom did, I guess.
Okay, is there anything that could convince you that you didn't exist?
No.
Okay, right. So if you think that the primary evidence for God is unfortunately evidence that we have to, it's the existence of conscious agents, where if it weren't the case, we wouldn't be around to observe it, then it's not going to be a problem. Just like if you a bunch of people fire at you, shoot a gun at you, there's nothing that can convince you that you didn't survive, even though it's more likely that you wouldn't survive, because if you hadn't survived, you wouldn't be around to observe it.
Right. This example with what are the odds that you would survive a firing range, and this is a nice example of a more general principle, which is that before you need a supernatural explanation, you've got to know that it wouldn't naturally occur. There are many things that are amazing that occur naturally all the time, and there are many really boring things that don't actually naturally occur. And the only time you ever need supernatural explanation is when something seems like it would be really likely that particularly doesn't naturally happen normally happens. And again, that's where you can say, well, let's broaden the sample. But since we know that normally people shot by fireworks squad die, the fact that you didn't die would be surprising then. Although, again, the fact that you're the rare exception and you wouldn't be around to ask the question unless you were the exception.
Wait, Matthew.
I think we're going to switch to Q&A.
Yeah, so, okay, can we make this your last response, I guess, and then we'll do maybe a summation where you guys will both get 2 minutes to...
Why don't we do a summation after Q&A?
Yeah. Oh, okay, sure. We can do it that way, yeah. Do you want to respond to Bryan's point, or do you want to...
Well, I mean, I would just say that if you are already very confident that there's no supernatural domain, then you shouldn't think that it explains lots of... that it's a legitimate way to explain the data. If there are surprising features about the world that are naturally explained by it. But my claim is, I don't see a reason to think that. If we have this very simple and parsimonious hypothesis, that even if it is supernatural in nature, the fact that it's supernatural, that doesn't give you a reason to reject it unless you just have a bias against the supernatural, which is not clear why we would.
Okay.
Where's first, Matthew, and I can share that.
Okay, sure, why not? Yeah.
So,
all right, with that, we have the bulk of the debate so far. We'll have a closing statement after some Q&A, but I'm going to turn it over to the audience. Does anyone have a question they'd like to ask either of our panelists? Anyone? All right. And I trust you guys to just pass the mic to each other, so pass it up to him when you're done.
So my question kind of relates to like the latter half of the arguments that were being made, related a lot to like the probability of events happening, right? And so my question is, like, if you consider like the space of all possible things that can happen, right? Even the space of all the things that we can't imagine that can happen, how can you use probability as like a valid argument for making deductions about the world if like everything seems improbable given the set of all things that can happen, right? Like sure, we can say that there are boring things that happen, but in the space of everything that can possibly happen, even the most mundane things about our world seem highly improbable, I guess. Yeah. And so in that regard, like, how can you use the argument that, like, the probability that things are the way they are, that they are the way they are, like, as a way of like kind of deducing things about our world, right? I understand probability for like logical deductions, but like physical deductions about the origins of our universe.
Yeah. Well, so the way you do it is you use Bayes' theorem, where so you look at the probability that you give to a hypothesis prior to looking at the evidence, and then you look at how many times more likely that evidence is on the hypothesis than on if the hypothesis isn't true. And so if we think, okay, we have this theory of theism where it starts out pretty good, it starts out, even before looking at the specific evidence, how simple it is, how parsimonious it is, it starts out getting maybe 10% share of the probability space. And then we see, well, it explains all these things very well. It's true that everything that happens will be improbable. But if there's a thing that's improbable on one theory, but probable on a different theory, then it happening is evidence for the theory on which it's less probable. Or less improbable. Oh, yeah.
So I think almost every story is going to say that in some sense every very specific thing is highly improbable. Just like if you throw 1,000 dice and then you get the answer, it's like, oh my god, what are the odds of that thing to happen? It's like, yeah, really low because every die turned out in that exact way. On the other hand, if you realize, well, something had happened, so it's certain that there would be some outcomes, like also true. Probably the best way of thinking about this is that you would say, well, what range is probable? Like you throw 106-sided dice and with language with an average value of 3.5, and then the sum comes to between 300 and 400. It's like, yeah, that's really likely that it would be in that range. And then there's something that's more specific than something that happened, but less specific than that exactly happened. So that is helpful. Yeah, I think a lot of the issue I have is that while philosophically I don't have any problem with prior probabilities, but still the basic way that we use probability theory and should is to say, all right, well, our current probability is the next prior probability. So we've updated on everything that we've got already, and that is the probability that we should be using from this point on, right? And it seems to me that Matthew sort of wants to roll the clock back to the time that, I mean, it's still not really convenient for him with the problem of evil and all, but in general he wants to roll the problem from himself back to this earlier point, and I'm saying, look, it doesn't make sense to roll back to a period when we have a lot less information. Why don't we just use the information we currently have and then try to explain from there?
I respect her. Yeah, I mean, so it's true that every particular event that will happen is a very low probability event. But if there's a theory that naturally that has a higher probability that explains why that particular low probability event could happen, then that's solid evidence for the theory. And this
All right, so suppose you actually do get double the normal number of ones after throwing the 100 different six-sided dice. At that point, would you say that this is even modern evidence the dice are loaded, realizing that there are so many different patterns that we could have found after the fact, and so actually the fact that there is whether we found one probable pattern in the results is actually highly probable, in fact.
Yeah. Well, so it might be moderate evidence, but it wouldn't be especially strong evidence because as many ways as there are for the coin to turn out, there are equally many ways for the dice to be rigged arbitrarily. And so as a result, the theory that the coin just naturally turned out that way is just as improbable as the theory that the dice were rigged to turn out that way. Now, in a case where it's not that way, where the rigging hypothesis explains better, where there's some sequence which we'd expect it to rig, so for instance, if they all came up heads, or all except one came up heads or something, then that's the time when you would have reason to expect that it was rigged, because it's so much more likely.
Yeah, I just wanted to I'll ask about the sort of the theistic perspective. Can you elaborate a little bit more on how you can explain natural evils, and not like one person listening to somebody else, like when a tsunami kills hundreds of thousands of droughts and floods or these things,
So like the earthquake of 1755.
And just in my sort of subjective human experience, seemed like there's just no way to justify it.
Yeah, well, so I mean, there are a few things. First, I mean, the explanation of why there are all these evils, would take much longer to answer than a minute or so. But there are a few broad points. The first one is that I don't think we're in a position to evaluate whether particular evils are especially unlikely if there's God, because we only see the first, say, 70 years of effect of various things. And so we're not able to see that sort of infinite time stretching into the future. Second of all, many of the evils, you can use free will to explain natural evils if you think that there are for instance, that like we're in a simulation or something, or we think that there are some other beings that influence things. Now that's a sort of more creative hypothesis, but there are all sorts of explanations that you can give. I think ultimately, despite all these explanations, evil will still be powerful evidence against theism, but I think that the evidence against theism is going to be outweighed by the evidence for theism. So it's like evil is really, it's a big mystery. But then, why there's evil if there's God? The naturalist has like 8 different mysteries that I think are.
It just seems to me like sort of invoking like the idea of infinity after a 70-year human lifespan is fundamentally not very conservative. Like you're invoking a lot both the existence of God and the existence of some sort of infinity after a human life.
Well, if we have a reason to think that if God exists, then there would be an afterlife, which I think we do. Why if God would have no reason to just cut things off arbitrarily, then once you have theism, it naturally predicts the existence.
I've got to point out the massive double standard here, where if we see a tsunami kill 1 million people, it's like, well, we haven't had enough time to see what good could come of it. Whereas when Matthew looks at good things in the world and says, wow, it's really strong that God exists as an infinitely good God. It's like, well, by that standard, why do we have to wait an infinite amount of time or millions of years to say that things were actually good?
Well, in order to have a plan where everything turns out well for the best, you have to have agents in the first place. And so I agree that if your evidence was just like you pointed to good things, like you were like, look around, look at that squirrel, that's a pretty good squirrel. Okay, I agree in that case, that would be significantly undercut by skeptical theism. But all the things I pointed to are not specific instances of good things, but rather there are broad features that for reality to turn out good on the whole, you have to hammer. So it doesn't require projecting, the long-term effects of it. And I agree. I think that evil, it's a difficult problem for theism. If people sort of want to read my response in more depth, I had an article called, I think, Theistic Theory of Everything, where I defend a particular solution to it. But yeah, it's a real problem. But sometimes even the best view of reality will have some certain mysteries, and it explains a lot, and that's the reason it's done.
I'll say I think there's an incredible number of mysteries. There's still many. I'm mystified every day, but I don't see the problem.
I'm less mystified than Bryan every day. Because I have a theory that explains a lot of mystifying things.
Well, it's easy to not be mystified if your theory explains everything, Matthew.
Yeah. Well, it's an advantage of theory to explain only things that happen, rather than explaining predicting lots of things that don't happen.
Indeed.
Maybe we should go to a different question.
Another question.
I just wanted to further ask a question about the problem of suffering, that you brought up earlier. I'm totally in the same boat. From a theistic standpoint, the problem of suffering really breaks my heart. Seeing tsunamis, seeing all the evil going on in the world. I work with a lot of people experiencing homelessness and people who are dying. But I still believe in God, and I think I just want to ask your idea of, you said there can't be an all-powerful, all-good God because of suffering, and the only possible explanation is the Gnostic idea of a good God and a bad God, or just a morally bipolar God being plausible. But I'm just
or none.
Or none, yes. But from this, I'm just asking from a different angle, would it also be plausible to claim the existence of a good, infinitely powerful God who allows evil from us, powerful spiritual being like Satan in the Christian theology, and then who sent his son to enter into suffering and to love us throughout the suffering and almost make suffering turn beautiful? I don't know.
So I'm just going to do as a parent. So, as a parent, if I was allowing my child to suffer and I could easily go and solve the problem, and then I said, yeah, you gotta understand something really beautiful is going to come out of this, I think you would rightly say I was a terrible parent. And I think the same goes for a God that would allow this kind of suffering. He's got the power to go and end it very easily, then he totally should have. And if it comes down to, who are you to ask questions? Here I'm quoting the book of Job, in case you're curious. Who are you to ask questions? Did you create the firmament? All right, so you're very powerful, and I'm very scared to go shut up now, but I do agree.
Yeah, well, so I don't think we would think that about a parent, where if a parent did allow their child to undergo suffering, if it truly benefited their child in the long run, particularly if the benefits lasted forever, and so benefited them infinitely more than the cost, then we would think that's permissible. We don't think this.
What about a parent who just said, look, it might seem your whole life you're suffering, and I have this pill that solves it, but there's an afterlife, so it's going to be really great in the end. And yes, I'm actually a great parent. I think your reaction would be, you're a monster, you're a fanatic, you're crazy, give the kid the pill, or actually put the parent in jail, and I'll give the parent the pill.
Yeah. Well, so I agree. In a normal case, if we see a person who inflicts suffering on their child, and it doesn't seem to have a redeeming benefit.
But they say there's an afterlife. It's going to solve that. It all gets more than balanced out.
But if the things that you have reason to expect an actual human parent to know are very different from the things that you have reason to expect an all-powerful God to know.
Well, but maybe they read your essay and they know there's an afterlife.
Yeah, well, they don't know which kind of suffering will be ideal for moral and spiritual development. I mean, so for instance, we often do think that if a parent gives their child, if there's a surgery that would be painful, that would benefit one's child in the long run, we think that it's permissible to allow, and in fact, it's obligatory to allow one's child to undergo the surgery. And so, if God knows and so then the question is just, are the things that enable the sufferings of this life, do they produce benefits in the long run? Well, I think trying to guess that would be like trying to guess whether or not, after only observing the first move of the chess game, whether or not the person is playing perfectly. If you only see the first 7 years of an infinitely long story, if you both have 0% of the total knowledge and only see 0% of the total picture, then I don't think you're in a position to guess whether or not there are redeeming benefits. And there are all sorts of redeeming benefits that theists have thought come from it, like buildings, in various cases promoting moral and spiritual development, providing us with free will produces all these benefits. Many of the sufferings allow people to sort of forge stronger connections through the suffering. Now, I think that the story about the problem of evil is going to be a little bit more general. The full story would take a few minutes to get into it, so I won't subject you all to that. But
And I'd say that we would be very skeptical of any parents allowing their child to suffer for no good reason. And I think on the grounds of there being some afterlife, it's not just because we don't think the parent has experiences to acknowledge the afterlife, it's just we say that a person who justifies doing horrible things to people in the observed world on the grounds of afterlife is crazy. And it's like, you can have your religion, you can believe, you can say this or this very, but you can't actually have people suffer on the basis of this because it's kind of made up, and we kind of know this actually. I have actually talked to religious people about the question of, so like if your child dies prematurely, are you happy because now they get to have eternal bliss sooner? And the answer is like, well, we'll miss them, but surely it would be better for the child. Like, yeah, it doesn't seem like even you believe your own story. It seems more like this is a story that you've been told that you're supposed to say in this case. It just seems totally made up.
Yeah, well, so that would be my answer, because I think, the fact that we exist on Earth and, spend time here shows that there are some benefits that come from it, right? Because otherwise, God wouldn't put us here.
Also the same for the suffering, the death, and everything else, right?
Right, and so if there are benefits that come from it, there are enough that make it good in the long run, then if a person is brought out of it prematurely, that will be bad for them in the long run. So that's why it's bad for people to die.
First I have a clarifying question for the atheist side. So would you say that in benevolent but not all-powerful God, which is not be considered a perfect God, and that's not?
Yeah, that's what I heard say 2,500 years ago. So yeah, like if you were to say that there's some really, some very benevolent and highly powerful being in the universe, but they're not infinite, I'd say yeah, it's almost certain because the universe is so big. There's got to be some alien life way more advanced than us, and some of them would be good. There's probably some really bad ones too.
Okay, and I have another challenge from the Gnostic side. I'm wondering how you respond to this. So it seems like you're a foundationalist. You said it's possible to believe in principles like 1 + 1 = 2, but where is the basis of that? I'm wondering how you can possibly endorse knowledge if you reject circular logic or circular reasoning.
Yeah, say something's just obvious, and that's good enough. Say it's obvious. There is, like the 5-year-old has mastered the art of repeatedly asking why to make anybody look stupid. You say why is it one day? Because the sun. And why is there a sun? Well, because matter clusters. And why does it do that? And pretty soon you're left looking stupid. And it's like, a lot of times the answer is yeah, it's just obvious. And I don't have anything better, but also you don't need anything better than it's obvious.
Pass it down, please. Thank you.
Right, I think we want to keep the mic for people out in TV land.
Oh, yes. Awesome. When talking about the 4 fundamental constants, this is for Bryan. You said they are because they just had to be that way. How could you argue against a theist who uses the uncaused causer argument that says the universe God has to exist because the universe had to come into being, he just had to create it? When you use the same logic about they just had to be that way.
I mean, I'd say that in some sense I'm fine with the uncaused causer. I'll say the uncaused causer is stuff, matter, observed reality. And that's the thing that doesn't require any explanation. I mean, if you do go with the idea that everything that exists requires some cause, then there is, again, a classic argument that existed thousands of years before I was born, saying, well, if God caused the universe, who caused God? And then you say, well, God doesn't need an explanation. I'm just going to go with the universe doesn't need an explanation, and that's simpler. It's one last thing to posit.
In both cases, we're going to posit some fundamental thing, but for the reasons I've argued, which we didn't address much, if theism is a simpler theory, given that it posits just one thing, perfection.
Yeah, and atheism is a very simple theory too. It says what you see is what you get, and the things that people posit are, if you don't see them, they probably aren't there.
Okay, well, but if what you see is a lot of complicated things, then the theory that what you see is what you get is not a simple theory. That theory tells you how you know which things, but it doesn't tell you what the things are. And so if you saw a really complicated thing, then what you see is what you get does not tell you that the thing is simple.
Yeah, so many things are both simple and complicated at the same time, depending on how you look at it. And one of the attributes of a great teacher or an educator is taking something that seems very complicated and making it simple to someone that didn't already understand. And I'll say the slogan, what you see is what you get, is a really simple slogan that does illuminate life very well.
But we're not talking about how simple it is to like understand or like teach to students. We're talking about how simple it is in terms of how many things you have to posit, how many things you think about the world. So, the theory that, fundamental physics is pretty simple in that there aren't that many laws, but nonetheless, it's not simple in that it's easy to explain. I think you can have a lot of parts to it that make it non-parsimonious, even if the thing itself is very easy to explain.
I also have one more question, sorry. On your point about like evolution and you were talking about like conscience, you talked about like it developed because like evolution caused it to develop that way, but that like posits like ontologically that being is greater than not being. So like how like that we naturally have an inclination to be instead of not be. So like does that have an origin, or is that just also like fundamental to the universe?
I'd say so. Evolution doesn't posit that being is better than not being or anything like that. It just says that some kinds of things tend to survive and thrive, and other things don't, and that's all that's necessary. So think about it like this: it's totally possible, actually, that we are evolving into a world where human beings are extremely stupid. And what would be required? We would just need to go and have much higher fertility for people of lower intelligence combined with their higher ability of intelligence, and put that together, and we'll evolve to be extremely stupid. That doesn't show that it's better to be stupid than to be smart. It just shows that evolution works in just a way like whenever things cause more of that thing, good or bad. If you've ever seen blind fish, right, you think, why are these blind fish? Well, they evolved in a cave and there's no light, and so they don't really need to have vision anymore, and then they have no resources and they go blind. Well, is it really better to be blind? It doesn't seem like it. So anyway, the main thing going on in the case of consciousness, the argument that I had was just that it might seem at first like, why do we even need consciousness? Why couldn't we all just be living zombies or something like that, just robots? And I'll say, well, probably the best insight we'll get on why we have conscious thoughts rather than just being everything automatic is if you go and compare things where you need conscious thought to be good at them and things where you don't. So you don't need to consciously think about your heart to beat, so that thing we've evolved to not consciously think about it. On the other hand, to come up with a very clever and intelligent plan, that's one where conscious thought is important. And so I say that's the evolutionary advantage of consciousness, because we see those are the things where it really is helpful. And so beings that can do that are more likely to survive and not survive in children.
Yeah, well, I think that misstates the thing that needs to be explained, which is not why, given that consciousness is a thing that can exist in the physical world, why do you have any of it? I agree, evolution can explain that. But the question is, why is it the case that when you combine matter in a certain way, consciousness switches on? Explaining that, that's why I'm trying to explain gravity by saying, well, evolution is like for gravity, otherwise we fly off into space. Where the thing being...
That's not that bad of an argument, actually.
Wait, what? No, that is a bad argument, because gravity created evolution, and the reason why there's evolution has nothing to do with, the reason why there's gravity has nothing to do with the presence of evolution. Evolution didn't cause gravity to be that way, and similarly, evolution didn't cause it to be the case that certain arrangements of matter produce consciousness. Once you have the fact that certain arrangements of matter produce consciousness, then evolution explains why those certain arrangements of matter arise, but it doesn't explain why you have that fact in the first place.
Again, on the Adlestein theory that a theory gets confirmed just by the fact that it explains some things, I'd say it actually is fine. It's like, well, let's see, without gravity we'd be flying into space, but we didn't, and then, well, gravity explains the fact that we're not doing it. So at least it's pointing in its favor. I'm saying it's a great argument, but it seems like you should not disown it anyway, because it is in your general wheelhouse.
Wait, I agree gravity explains why we don't fly off in space. My claim is evolution. You don't say evolution explains gravity because, maybe you don't say evolution explains gravity because evolution without gravity would make us fly into space. Because gravity, if A explains B, then A has to be the reason why B exists. Now, if B existed, and that can only happen if B existed only after A. If it predated A, then you can't, I can't explain the existence of my mother.
Okay. So my other question is primarily directed towards Dr. Caplan. I'm not sure how much this goes pro or contra the thing being discussed, but specifically the phenomenon of consciousness. I'm more curious about, because you can see how the evolutionary argument says why we grow capable of complex thinking, but it doesn't seem at all necessary that evolution gives rise to consciousness per se as a phenomenon in our minds. And so I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that, how it seems to have the material world, and then we have the phenomenon of consciousness.
Yeah, so the problem with our minds, it's one of the great ones in philosophy. It's like, well, so if I wasn't conscious, it would never occur to me that anyone else was, which is true and also funny. So yeah, if you were conscious, nothing would ever occur to you. What I would say is, is there some physically necessary theory by when consciousness would have to arise? As far as I can tell, absolutely not. I have, very good, my best friend's a physicist, and he keeps saying that physics textbook explains consciousness, and I keep saying, show me how. Show me the line in the textbook that predicts that I will feel pain. And yeah, so he doesn't have a good answer there. So I'd say, yeah, I don't know that. I actually don't understand any of the physical laws either, if you want the honest truth, so I just know that some really smart people say it all works out, and I'm not interested enough to challenge them. They seem really reliable in a lot of other ways. In the case of why consciousness grows, I would just fall back on, all right, our best explanation is going to be to go and look at what is the apparent functional advantage of this in evolutionary terms. And that's where you can see, well, when is it that conscious thought works better than unconscious behavior? And sometimes it does, and then once you recognize that, it's like, well, that's probably the right evolutionary angle to go with here, just the same way that, like, why do we have eyelids? As far as I know, there's no actual experiment showing that eyelids are evolved to protect our eyes, but it's like, come on, like, that makes total sense that they would exist to protect our eyes.
Yeah. But again, that's like using evolution to explain gravity, where the thing that needs to be explained is that when you have certain arrangements of matter that combine in certain ways, consciousness mysteriously switches on in a way that's, as you agree, not predicted by the physical laws. There's no way that, if there was a God who wanted to create conscious agents, we would expect that, while if there was not a God who wanted to create conscious agents, we would not expect that.
Again, going back to prior versus posterior probability, given what we know, we should know what we expect it. Right? You keep wanting to go and turn the dial back to some period before we have any empirical knowledge, and that's not a sensible dial to turn. We should go and explain the world given what we know.
So the way we know Julius Caesar existed, we have all these, or Alexander the Great, we have all this writing about him, we have all these claims about him. That's the primary way we know that he existed. Now you can say, look, you can't count this as evidence. We observed this before we knew that Alexander the Great existed. You're trying to turn the dial back to before we knew that he existed. But the point is, even a theory, the way that you think the world is, can be confirmed based on explaining things that you already know about. And in fact, that's widely accepted in science. And one of the reasons why, for instance, evolution caught on early is that there were lots of things that were quite puzzling that were explained quite well by evolution. Now, so it seems like you agreed earlier that maybe it doesn't count as much, but it still does count that a theory explains past data. And so then if we have all these pieces of past data, are very unlikely that it isn't explained well, that's a good reason to be against.
It is a reason, not necessarily a good reason. As you know, I just dispute that you have this evidence. In fact, the evidence goes against you. Should we have time for a last question, Jonah? Or should we
Any other questions?
I'm happy to hang around and keep talking. I've got nothing else to do today.
I don't want to ask this next question, though, if someone asks. Okay, my question is for the theist side, where like a lot of the arguments seem to be based on the existence of like conscious actors, like us, for example, right? But if the current like best scientific predictions for how our universe is going to play out by like heat death and whatnot, it seems like conscious actors are going to be like very small, like seemingly insignificant blip in the like timeline of the whole universe, right? Like the vast majority of the existence of the universe will be spent without the existence of conscious actors, right? So like, how do you explain that first off, and then how can you use like such a small portion of the universe and of its whole existence to make such grandiose not assumptions, but like the theories?
Yeah, well, I mean, the way you figure out, the fact that humans are small and we occupy a small share of the universe, that doesn't tell you whether the reason the universe was created had to do with us in mind. You would only have a reason to expect that if you thought that God would have a reason to basically fill the universe with people, when I don't think we have a reason to accept that, particularly if you think that he's going to create all possible people and just put them all somewhere. We have no reason to expect and to put them all in some, stuff them all in the same universe. So I don't think that's a particularly good reason to doubt how the universe was designed.
Alright, so do we want to have the closing things, or
Yeah.
are we out of time?
Do you have time for it? I have time for it. Sorry,
Okay, like 5 minutes, right?
What's it, 2 minutes? How much time do you want to give us for?
I would go 7 minutes. I have 7 minutes worth of stuff to say.
What?
All right, 7 minutes.
Should I go first? Okay. Let me set my 7-minute timer. Okay. So in this debate, Bryan has not given any reasons to think that God does not exist. He's just disputed the reasons to think that God does exist. And so if there are good reasons to think that God does exist, then that gives you a reason that he does. So my first claim is that that we have reason to think that the existence of God is at least reasonably probable before we're looking at the evidence. Now, Bryan's been treating the existence of God as a really improbable thing, much less likely than the existence of aliens. The type of thing where even if you discovered that all the atoms in the universe had a little "made by God" written in small font, he thinks that still wouldn't be good evidence because the existence of God is such an improbable theory. Okay, why think that? Well, I've given a reason to think that the existence of God is very, it's an ontologically unique theory. It's unlike anything else. And so it would be dogmatic to think that the existence of God starts out so much less likely than the alternative way, given that these are radically different ways of reality being. Now, Bryan brings up the problem of evil and the problem of divine hiddenness. We discussed that a little bit in the cross-examination period. The basic point is, I don't think we're in a position to judge whether evils are ultimately turn out for the worse, given that, one, many of these evils, the claim is not that they're good, but that they're an unfortunate side effect of other good things like free will, and two, we only observe the first 70 years, and just like if you only observe the first move in an infinitely long game, you'll not be in a position to judge whether the players were particularly good. In a similar way, if you only observe 70 years out of an infinitely long time, have 0% of the total information about what's going on, you are not in a position to judge whether it's improbable. And if you think we're not in a position to judge whether evil is improbable, the same thing is true of divine hiddenness, the fact that God doesn't reveal himself. There isn't a reason to expect that God would reveal himself. Now finally, Bryan brings up the fact that, God hasn't revealed himself, very few people seem to know him, and he thinks that that's improbable. Well, if you think that the fact that lots of people don't know that God exists is strong evidence against God, then you have to think that the fact that nearly all people in human history have believed in God, and many people can have what they consider a close relationship with God, believing him to be the most important person in their life, that would have to be evidence for the existence of God, if the fact that people don't know about the existence of God is evidence against the existence of God. My next claim is that theism is a better explanation of the existence of conscious agents. And so there are a wide variety of different things that you need for conscious agents. You need laws, you need physical stuff, you need finely tuned laws, you need the laws being capable of generating complexity, you need consciousness, you need the stuff that produces consciousness when combined with the laws. So you need both the law that says that brains produce consciousness and for there to happen to be brains. And then you need the consciousness to be able to generate these rich, harmonious relationships where your consciousness influences the world in an important way such that it's selected for. Now Bryan, he asserts, we haven't measured it. We have measured the laws of physics, we have never seen them change, and so as a result, we should think that the odds that they can change are low. That is not the way you determine what things are metaphysically possible. That's not the way you determine which things can be different in theory. That is the way you determine which things can be different in accordance with the physical laws. But remember, we're trying to explain the existence of the physical laws. And so, of course, the laws being different is not consistent with the physical laws. But the thing that we're trying to explain is why the physical laws are as they are, why the cosmological constant falls in this extremely narrow range that happens to be required for life. And if that's much more strongly predicted on theism than it does on atheism, then it's strong evidence for theism. Now, next Bryan says, we haven't really measured the cosmological constant or any of these things to a great degree. This isn't true. If you look at physics journals, there's very widespread consensus about the fine-tuning of the universe. There are half a dozen different constants that there's widespread agreement that they're finely tuned, like the early conditions of the universe, the low entropy state, the relationship between the electromagnetic force and the weak nuclear force, the relationship between the electromagnetic force and gravity. It just isn't true that we don't know if the constants are finely tuned. We have quite a lot of evidence for it. Now, Bryan says, well, in order to have really good evidence, we have to be able to make predictions in advance. Well, that isn't true, as shown by essentially the entire field of history, where we never make predictions in advance, but we still often have very good reasons to believe that things happen like Alexander the Great. And so if you agree that the existence of God is a reasonable hypothesis that's on the table, you don't think that its odds are near zero, for the reason I gave, and then it explains a lot, then you should believe in the existence of God because it explains so much, just like you should believe in the existence of Alexander the Great because his existence makes sense of so many things that would otherwise be extremely puzzling. Now, next Bryan says, in response to my point that it's very mysterious that you have, a certain pattern of fleshy stuff in human skulls that just consciousness turns on. He says, well, evolution explains it. Evolution doesn't explain it any more than evolution explains why there's gravity. The thing that's puzzling is not that once you have the physical states that can produce consciousness, that they will produce consciousness. The thing that's puzzling is that there are physical states that can produce consciousness in the first place. If there is a God who wants to create conscious agents, then we would expect that to be the case. If there is not, then we're not expected to be the case. Bryan says that, in my third claim, is that theism best explains the existence of moral knowledge, why we have this ability to figure out moral facts, given that the moral facts can't make a difference to the atoms in our brain, and so in order for us to have justified moral knowledge, as Bryan and I agree we have, you have to think that the presence of that the moral facts in some way make a difference to what we believe, but they can't move around the position of atoms, so we have to have this non-physical way of figuring out what the moral facts are, this non-physical way of intuiting the moral facts, and that's much more strongly predicted on theism. Now he says, well, evolution explains this, again, by making us smart, but again, the puzzling thing is why is it that there are laws that say that when you have certain brain states, you're able to give rise to consciousness that's able to figure out the moral facts. That's not guaranteed, it's not predicted on naturalism, that's not the type of thing that we would expect at all. He next claimed, he said, it's circular to use induction to justify induction. It's not using induction to justify induction, it's using induction to explain how we know that how we know induction. So we know that induction works, just because it's obvious, as Bryan says, but the question is, okay, how do we get brains that are capable of having the knowledge that induction works? And theism naturally predicts that, just like it naturally predicts moral knowledge. Turn to my final argument, which is the craziest argument in the history of philosophy, according to Bryan, that if there is a God, that predicts the existence of every conscious agent, and so that means it's very likely that you in particular would exist. If not, it's very unlikely that you in particular would exist out of the uncountably infinite people that could exist. Bryan said, well, whoever it was would be around to observe this, and so it can't be evidence. Now imagine everyone in the world goes to sleep, then a coin's flipped. If it comes up heads, everyone's looking up. If it comes up tails, only 5 people are looking up. It's supposed to wake up. I submit you get strong evidence that it's heads, and the reason you get strong evidence that it's heads is that even though someone has to wake up, the most specific version of the evidence is that you in particular woke up. And you in particular waking up is more likely if there is a God, if it came up heads and tails. And so in a similar way, a theory that predicts every possible person that exists makes it more likely that you would exist, and thus is a better explanation of your existence in particular. And if there's a theory that explains an otherwise very improbable event, like the fact that you exist by predicting every possible person exists, then that theory ends up doing well. So yeah, thanks for listening, everyone, and thanks, Bryan.
Thanks also to everyone for listening, especially thanks to Jonah for setting it up.
Can you give him center stage so that I can see him? Awesome. Thanks.
All right. Thanks very much to Jonah for setting everything up. Really appreciate it. If you don't know Jonah, you should know Jonah. Jonah is great. And Matthew was also great.
I think you're great too, Bryan.
All right, thank you. However, basically wrong about everything important. He said many true things today, actually, but the claims that are unique to his position are not true. Just to back up a little bit, just understand what is a good philosophical argument. A good philosophical argument has to start with something that's obvious to a person that doesn't already agree with you, and then takes that person to a conclusion that was actually somewhat surprising. I don't think that Matthew has done anything like that. Instead, we have a bunch of arguments where you have to accept something really weird and bizarre, even for the argument to get off the ground. It would have made more sense for him just to say it just seems that there's a God, than for them to give most of these arguments. I guess his first one kind of is that one, but for the others, these are just really weird arguments. For example, the one which I actually didn't say was the worst argument. I said it was in the bottom 10 arguments. The one, the fact that you exist is evidence that every possible being exists, and then where are they with the multiverse? All right, it's like, gee, I believe in God before I believe in the multiverse. That's really weird, right? Maybe in Marvel movies, but yeah, otherwise you have to really work on me, and it's just a very strange thing to ask someone to accept as a premise of your argument. Would make more sense just to go and state God exists and talk about the multiverse. Let's see. You say, I still think there is this equivocation on probability, right? To say, like, what are the odds that gravity would be where it is? And you say, well, logically, it could be anything. It's like, yeah, well, once you realize that almost everything's logically possible, the fact that something's logically possible is no longer very important or interesting, and you realize, all right, we're not going to get anywhere with logical possibility, we've got to look at the facts. And once we look at the facts, then some things we measure and we say, well, they vary widely. Like if you say, well, how tall are people? There we actually have wide variation. Right? The shortest person ever measured is only 1 foot 8 inches tall. Really? He's alive. All right, so that's something where we look at the world and we say, well, what's logically possible for people to be any height that's greater than 0? All right, great. Then we go and we look. Whereas Matthew seems like he wants to get a lot of mileage out of this logical possibility, and I say, look, you can't get much out of it. You've got to look at the facts, and once you look at the facts, you know them, and you've got to reason from there. And once you do that, then there are so many arguments for why he's wrong, which, like I said, I don't claim much originality for most of this, because most of these arguments have been around for thousands of years, and they are about as good as you're ever going to get in philosophy. Thank you very much.